Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been really a pleasant 2 days. Professor Norton was kind enough to fly me in yesterday. You know, I figured going to Chicago at this time of year, I better give myself an extra day. And I come out here and I feel like I'm in North Carolina or something, so that's nice. I teach at the University of Toronto. Toronto has been spared the winter, but I live in a rural town further up north, which is where the snow belt apparently decided to end this year. So I walk out, I have about a feet of snow, but out here, I'm good. So yes, so as was mentioned, the talk tonight is about both the history of the globalized food supply chain, but also this whole local food movement. Well, let me begin then. So in essence, I want to discuss briefly what this local food movement is about, or at least the main themes that I have identified in it. And then I want to take a step back, well actually several steps back, and in cases you could say I want to take a marathon back. I want to go back to the beginning of the international trade in food. And again, ask the simple question, well, if things were so great in the past, which is essentially what the Locavores want us to go back to, why did so many people work so hard to develop the globalized food supply chain? And so there's a problem after all. Oh, okay. Okay, I think it will work now better. Okay, sorry. I pushed the wrong button. I apologize. Do I need to start over? You're good? Okay. And then I will argue that, well, the globalized food supply chain was really developed for a reason. And these reasons pretty much undermine the case that is put forward by Locavores. So if you're not familiar with Locavores, although I believe that there's hardly a college town today that hasn't heard the word, herbivore eat plants, carnivores eat meat, and locavores eat local. Now, of course, the definition of local varies from one region to another. The movement really started in Berkeley a couple of decades back, and also in London, you know, places where you can grow a lot of food pretty much year-round. But then I was in Bozeman, Montana, where Montana State University is located a couple of years ago, and there, instead of having this 100-mile diet that is so popular in in locations that are more suitable to agricultural production, in Bozeman, the local was defined as within 300 miles. And then you go on the US Department of Agriculture policy papers on the issue, and they go like, well, anything grown in Texas is really local. And I mean, Texas is much bigger than many countries I've been to. So, and then in Canada, of course, you've got our national retail chain that say that, well, anything grown in the second largest country on earth is actually really local. So what is local? Well, it's kind of hard to define, but in essence, I want to keep this notion of, let's say, within a day's drive of where people live, you know, stuff that is grown beyond a few hundred miles should not really be considered local, or at least in Locavore's eyes. And I don't think I'm being unfair when I say that. So how many of you have heard of Michael Pollan? Don't be shy, don't be shy. Yeah, the students, the adults haven't. That's typically what I've noticed over the years. All the kids, all the students know about Michael Pollan, and the adults perhaps not so much. Well, Pollan is not writing only about local food, but he's certainly perhaps the closest thing the local food movement has to an intellectual rock star. So his main mantra these days is pay more, eat less. So in essence, our current system is so unsustainable that by definition it cannot last very long. So we need to go back to the kind of food that our great-grandmothers were eating, a more localized food production system. Yes, this will add a few digits to our grocery bills, but the result will be, you know, better environment, more social capital, and all sorts of good things. And so before coming here, I was not smart enough. I should have looked up what your college has in terms of local food. I'm pretty sure that there's a local food initiative, but I limited myself to Illinois, so some programs that some of you might be familiar with. Link Up Illinois, locally grown, the report of a 2009 task force, so local food, farm and jobs, growing the Illinois economy. And as in many other large cities in this country, but also many small college towns, there is something called Edible Chicago. It's a magazine that seeks to promote this lifestyle. So what is this lifestyle about really? Well, in essence, again, to consume things that are grown closer to you than most of the stuff that you find in supermarkets these days. And this quote-unquote locavore or 100-mile or 300-mile rhetoric really says that there are a number of benefits associated with it, benefits that we've lost track of over the last few decades. So the first one is social. Well, we don't know who produces most of our food anymore, and many people don't like that. Going to farmers market, buying local food gets to expand your social circle. You get to meet the people who grow your food, you interact with them, you meet other like-minded people, and you expand your social horizons that way. And this is something that locavores value. I mean, the theme of relationships is, or improving or expanding relationships, is very strong in that literature. Then there is this idea that if you buy food from large supermarkets, well, all the money, or at least the profits, will end up very far from where you bought your food. So if you buy food that is grown in Mexico, eventually, typically, big multinational corporations will repatriate the profit elsewhere, whereas if you buy tomatoes that were grown locally, well, the farmer will keep his money, will go get a haircut locally. The person who gets the haircut will then go to the local restaurant, and whoever works at the local restaurant will get their car repaired by a local mechanic. And so by keeping the money locally, if you will, you end up creating a virtuous circle of economic development, or at least preserving jobs that already exist, as opposed to when that money or those profits end up in some other locations. Then there is also an environmental argument which says that transportation today is really powered by fossil fuels. I mean, people have been trying to come up with an electric car for 100 years, doesn't quite work. But in terms of transportation, container shipping, airplanes, trains that are powered by diesel when electricity is not available, well, you need to burn a lot of fossil fuel. Burning a lot of fossil fuel results in a lot of carbon dioxide being emitted in the atmosphere. And so why don't we try to cut down on the emissions associated with these fossil fuels by buying food locally, food that travels less. Security. So this is a bread line in post-World War Germany. So this is a 1919 picture. People did not have it easy. I mean, the civilian population during the First War in Germany, they were subjected to a blockade by the British Navy. And so what happens when you improve your standard of living by relying on foreigners, and then suddenly something goes wrong? Political turmoil, all-out war. Isn't increased food security worth paying a little bit more for money? I mean, this issue keeps popping up again in Locavore discussions. Another issue is that essentially, if you focus your agricultural production on large-scale monoculture and something goes wrong, you know, a virus comes along, the potato blight in Ireland, you're in serious trouble. If on the other hand you tend to produce most of your food locally, you will not produce only corn or only potatoes or only wheat or dairy cows or what have you. You will be forced to diversify your production. And you're safer that way because if something goes wrong with one of your crops or one of the type of livestock that you're caring for, well, at least you can always fall back on the other stuff that you're growing. And if something goes wrong with the monoculture, even if you might not starve because you can always import food from somewhere else in our modern societies, you might be in serious trouble in as much as you won't be able to generate enough income to buy that food. So less developed economies actually should avoid going down the monocultural road because if they put all their eggs in one basket, then things might go wrong. So in essence, if, let's say, people who are subsistence farmer in less advanced economies switch over to growing crops for foreign markets and something goes wrong, then they have nothing really to fall back on. Whereas if they keep to producing various little things from themselves, at least they're always more secure, food secure that way. Then health and safety reasons. Can you really trust those foreigners to feed you as well as they would feed their own children? Are they in there to make a quick buck? Do they care about you? It's a little joke here. I don't know if you can see that in the back down there. So that's the traditional USA FDA food pyramid. And then you've got China at the bottom here. So chemicals and other mystery proteins. So, okay, so as I will argue in a few minutes, there are significant problems, I think, with all these arguments. But honestly, I wouldn't care if locavorism was really limited to the realm of personal choices. I mean, if people want to buy local food, even though they pay more and they might get lesser quality, that would be fine with me. The problem I have with the literature, and the reason why my wife and I wrote the book, is that increasingly the locavore movement is becoming more coercive. So a lot of activists are now pressuring government to make sure that military bases, hospitals, prisons, school boards buy local food that is more expensive than other alternatives that are available. There are also a number of people who prevent, or at least are trying to enforce zoning laws that will prevent the redevelopment of marginal agricultural land near large cities. And increasingly, as we see things, and neither Iroquois and I are American, obviously, so my wife is Japanese, I'm Canadian. We depend to a large extent on the US market, but also on other potential markets. This movement can only lead, I think, if you follow it logically, to all-out protectionism between countries. And historically, you might have heard the old saying, if goods don't cross borders, armies eventually will. Agricultural protectionism, I would argue, is not a good policy in the long run. But in essence, what Locavores essentially want to do is take us back to maybe a century and a half ago. So this is a painting of a British city in the late 19th century. You can see, well, the nice old buildings, but also before shopping malls and supermarkets came along, people were buying most of their things locally in those outdoor stalls. But then, of course, this brings up the issue. I mean, if things were so great, why again did so many people work so hard to move beyond that, to develop the kind of food system that we have today? So in order to understand how this came to be, we have to step back. So I grew up in the countryside. My parents had an apple orchard, a sugar shack. I'm from Quebec. We produce most of the world's maple syrup. They also had other jobs, but I grew up in the countryside and couldn't wait to get out of there. I mean, I'm all thumbs. I really can't work outside. I mean, I became an academic for a reason. And, I work for the Quebec Farmers Union. I think I know a little bit what I'm talking about. And life in the countryside is not always so much fun. The problem, though, I feel today is that many people really get their notion of what life in the countryside was from Tolkien, The Lord of the Ring. You go see the hobbits, everybody is happy, everybody has nice teeth, everybody is well-fed, even a bit chubby, and the countryside seems nice. Insects have not eaten up everything. It never rains, it seems. They're not living in mud huts, or they're living in mud huts, but somehow they're cleaner than my apartment. I don't know. But is it really what life was like before? Well, no, not really. So if you look at the evidence, what you realize is that even long before agriculture came along, anthropologists tell us, people were trading goods between different ecosystems. So I'm Canadian. I've selected a Canadian example. This is British Columbia. So for those of you who don't know geography all that much, Seattle would be down here. Vancouver would be there. Vancouver Island, Victoria. But the interesting thing about British Columbia is that, of course, it remained isolated for a while, and we have relatively good records of what people were doing there before the Europeans came along. And in British Columbia, as you can see here, you have very different ecosystems within the province. So you've got the coastal area, which is, of course, rich in very good fishing grounds. And you've got the interior, where people were mostly hunter, although, of course, you had a number of salmon runs going up there within British Columbia. Well, anyway, what we know is that people did trade food between ecosystems. I guess people got tired of eating fish all the time, or people got tired of eating caribou meat all the time. And there's plenty of evidence, according to the descendant of these people, the natives who live there today, that people traded a lot between regions. So people on the coast would trade dry seaweed, edible candlefish grease, and dried salmon in exchange, essentially, for meat and berries from the interior. And obviously, people had an incentive, I guess. They were better off when they were trading and relying on resources that came from beyond their local territory. And again, their descendants are very adamant that this is how their ancestors used to live. But fast forward to agriculture. So this raises an interesting conundrum. Today, local food activists are very keen to talk about eating local. Well, what do they mean by that? Do they mean really local food? Well, if you look at the history of agriculture, there's really nothing that grows in Illinois today that is really local, except maybe for sunflowers. If you were to stick to a really North American diet, in essence, you would be eating turkey, salmon, blueberries, sunflowers, and not much else. Everything that we produce in North America, almost everything, not only the crops, like wheat obviously is from the Middle East, corn is from Mexico. You might consider that local, but as some of you probably know, corn is really a tropical plant, and it took thousands of years before it was adapted to the so-called corn belt. Rice is from China. There's really nothing that we grow in North America that is really local in that sense. But somehow that doesn't seem to be part of the local food debate. I just want to raise the issue, though. Because, for example, in Canada a few years ago, we had this big debate about cucumbers from India, which were essentially packed in Canada, were described as a Canadian products, and people were like, well, you know, cucumbers are Canadian, we should eat more local food. Well, actually, cucumbers are originally from India. And the apples that I grew up picking originally can be traced back to the Stan republics, you know, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, these kinds of places. I don't know what is the second largest crop in Illinois after corn, but I'm pretty sure that it didn't come from North America. Soybeans, that's true, China. Well, that's true, so corn, soybean rotation, I should have thought of that, thank you. Okay, so having taken the issue off the table, now let's look at how people used to live when they were really reliant on local food. So I've already mentioned subsistence agriculture. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term, it essentially refers to a state of affairs where farmers produce and consume most of what they do. Of course, historically, subsistence farmer would trade with their neighbors and perhaps a few miles down the river or something, but by and large, they tended to grow what they could and eat what they produced. Now, the interesting thing about subsistence agriculture is that diversity was at the heart of the system. You know, bad things will happen in life. Animals, livestock will die of some diseases. You might have a hailstorm or, again, you know, fungus infestation or what have you. So whatever subsistence agriculture system you look at, historically, whether it be in South China or around the Mediterranean, people would diversify their crop. They were essentially jacks of all trades, producing a little bit of everything. And when they were living in topographically diverse environments around the Mediterranean, where you would have various hill, plains, whatever, people would often try to spread the risks inherent to agricultural production by having little patches of land, you know, one, let's say, on a flat plain, then maybe on one side of a hill, then on another side of the hill, so that if a hailstorm comes, at least you won't lose everything. So diversifying productions and locations is what historically people who lived on local food had to do. The problem, though, is that when you're a jack of all trades, you're a master of none. So people were not very productive in terms of each specific crop. It's not like you can specialize on something and become better over time. So again, these are not people coming out of a Nazi concentration camp. This is a famine that took place in India in 1943. Something went wrong. Of course, there were bad war policies there, but this was typical of subsistence agriculture system. You rely on your own food, you'll have bad years, and 2 bad harvests in a row, and you're in serious trouble. So people are not very productive. And then, you know, you've got to deal with bad weather, insect pests, floods, plant and animal diseases. And when you're a subsistence farmer, you often grow crop in environments onto which they're not too well suited. Let's say wheat on a hillside, rock hillside, or something like that. So everywhere, the world over, famines were historically very significant. This is a painting by Vincent van Gogh that I like a lot. My Dutch is kind of bad, but essentially the art, but I had a Dutch friend tell me about it. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but essentially it's titled The Potato Eaters. And what Van Gogh wanted to do here was to describe what life was really like for European peasants in the 19th century. The way I usually explain this painting to my student is to think of your average cop TV show today and to see that, you know, somehow all cops were models in a previous point in their life. And, you know, all cops are good looking on American TV shows, less true on British shows though. But, and essentially historical paintings describing food are often like, I don't know, CSI Miami or whatever. They do not convey a real picture of what agricultural life was like, or at least peasant life was like. And here Van Gogh really wanted to do that. And so you can see people eating a lot of potatoes. Well, I don't know if you can see that in the back. Some bad coffee that has probably been boiled a few times, perhaps some dairy products on top of that, and that's pretty much it. And this was the real life of a European peasant. So a quote here I've taken from a respectable historian. Until the mid-1800s, most Europeans remained in a chronic state of undernourishment, and outside of harvest period, where you could add some produce, some vegetables to what you were eating, the standard fare of an 18th century German laborer was gruel and mush, so grains and lentils. This is what you would eat virtually every day all year, except at harvest time where you would add a few things to it. England, though, was a bit more advanced and more rural, most German rural regions at the time. It was actually probably the wealthiest society on earth with the Netherlands. And again, the typical food intake of a early 19th century English peasants would have been bread, a little cheese, bacon fat, wheat tea, beer, but mostly for adult males only, and on good days, modest amount of beef and mutton. And again, at harvest time, maybe you could add a few vegetables to that, but essentially that's what people were eating. This is what the vast majority of people were eating. And in England, as in other places, aristocrats, until very recently, tended to be much taller than commoners. In England, they were on average 5 inches taller. That's because they could eat meat every day and they could afford better food. But life for most people was not so pleasant. Okay, but obviously we began trading food over long distances a very long time ago. And this, I argue in the book, and I'm an economic geographer by training, I need to insist on that, this can only be explained by the emergence of cities. If you're going to take the risk to switch from subsistence agriculture to producing a few commodities on a large scale, you need a big market that you can deliver to and that allow you to save some capital that you can set aside for bad years. And so we see the first long-distance trade, essentially in goods like grains, emerging with the first cities a few thousand years ago. Now, why did cities emerge? And again, this is something that locavores don't understand. You cannot have economic growth without cities. Cities perform a number of functions for which there are no substitute. First of all, they're a crossroad for trade, so you can operate an airport. I mean, obviously, we're only half an hour on O'Hare, from O'Hare. Well, maybe at 3 o'clock in the morning, but anyway, we're not that far from O'Hare Airport. But the reason why you can have this big airport is because you have a number of people around it, a number of businesses, and you can justify operating a large transportation infrastructure. Then most businesses locate in cities because they need to be close to other businesses. You can have people who supply specialized input to a variety of line of works, and it makes economic sense to be located there. It wouldn't make sense for many of these firms to relocate to smaller towns. And then here, I apologize for the jargon, but knowledge spillovers is what we economic geographer call the process by which people learn from each other. There's a lot of ideas exchanged in cities. You learn a specific skill in a particular line of work, then without having to relocate to your family, you can take that particular skill set to a completely different line of work. People learn all the time, and cities play an important role in that respect. And then the division of labor, and for this I want to use a quote that is over 2,000 years old by Xenophon. I don't know if you still teach the classics here, but Xenophon was kind of important historically, at least as far as historians are concerned. And Xenophon has a portion of an essay in which he explains why economic development cannot proceed without cities. And in essence, what he says is the following thing. He says, in a small city or in a small village, the same men must make beds, chairs, plows, tables, and houses. And by definition, he cannot be very good at any of those things because he can never specialize. In the large cities of his days, Athens and a few others, necessarily the man who spent all his time and trouble on the smallest task will do that task the best. And he says in cities, people specialize in very, very narrow things. It's not just that in cities people will specialize in making shoes, for example, but already in his days, some people specialize in only making women's shoes. The people who manufacture men's shoes are not the same people who manufacture women's shoes. And so people become ever better over time because they specialize in things, and in the aggregate, 10,000 people living in a city can be much more creative and can use resources much more efficiently than 10,000 people living on subsistence farms. And that's just the basic logic of cities. You cannot have economic development without cities, and you cannot have cities without long-distance trade in food. Now, a lot of people are always like, well, what about the internet? What about all these new wonderful technologies? Well, there's a place that's called Silicon Valley. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, south of San Francisco, you know. Google, Facebook, all these gadgets that you use can, to a large extent, be traced back to Silicon Valley. You would think people would not need to be close to each other, but this is obviously some of the most expensive real estate on earth. Even in the most intangible industries, if you will, people need to be close to other people. And there's no sign of these trends becoming less important. So this was produced by one of my colleagues at U of T, Richard Florida. We're actually people in Richard's team. So my wife is from the largest metropolitan agglomeration on earth here. This is Tokyo. You can see the spike here. Chicago obviously occupies a significant portion here. But the point is that the more advanced economies become, the more urbanized they become. During, let's say, Ming China or during the 80s of the Roman Empire, perhaps 5 to 10% of the population was living in cities. You cannot have a modern advanced economies with at least 80 to almost 85% of the people living in large urban agglomerations. And as Plato observed again, I like to go back to show how old these trends are. As Plato observes over 2 millennia ago, you have a bunch of, I assume most of you have read Plato, unlike in most other institutions. You might remember at one point all the philosophers get together and try to argue, well, where should we put our ideal city? And somebody raises a question. I don't know if it's Glaucon or another one. I don't quite remember. Well, can we locate it in a place where it will be self-sufficient, where we don't need to import anything? And obviously Socrates goes, well, no, you cannot. Obviously, to find a place where nothing needs to be imported is well nigh impossible. And again, this is over 2,000 years ago. You cannot have economic development without cities. You cannot have cities without long-distance trade. So how were cities fed historically? Well, it was always a combination of local and long-distance food, which depended, I argue, on three things: the state of preservation technology for specific food items. So some, like grains and sugar, basically can be kept and are no problem, so that's why people have been trading them for a long time. But others need to be put in brine, dried, smoke, and eventually in time, frozen, flash frozen, these kinds of things. So the state of preservation technology for food does matter. Production technology do matter, and obviously transportation matters a lot. So historically, most people today don't realize how bad land transportation was historically. So here you have farmers, peasants, trying to bring food to the city, which is located down there somewhere. I don't know if you can see in the back how bad the road is, but this is a good day. It's not muddy, it's not too slippery. And yet, these people can only move so much food over a very little distance on land. So historically, for example, in the late 17th, early 18th century, taking goods from Manchester to Liverpool in England, or let's say to New York and 30 miles inland, cost just as much as shipping the whole thing across the Atlantic. That's how inefficient land transportation was historically. Maritime transportation played a key role in supplying large markets. So until the railroad came along, the best possibility you had was to dig canals and have horse move things along here. So some basic data. Historically, one horse in the late 18th century could carry, I'm sorry, these are in kilograms. Is that a problem for you? It's been a while since I've talked to Americans. I apologize for that. So 100, multiply by 2, that will give you an idea in terms of pounds. So 125 kilograms on its back, 2,500 kilograms on a land cart, about 30,000 kilograms if it is pulling a barge along a river, and up to 50 tons in a barge on a quiet canal. But still, again, canals are very expensive to build. I mean, people are digging them with picks and shovel. You need to get the water in there. So only the most advanced societies can really afford to build canals. And in other places, people have to rely on land transportation, and there's only so much, or rather so little, that you can move over land. So historically, in cities, a lot of food had to be produced locally. And typically, this was the kind of food that didn't travel well. So think of milk and eggs, for example, or things that needed or required organic waste. So pigs, for example, were kept in a number of cities to convert organic waste into food. Rabbits, chickens, horticulture too needed a lot of horse manure, so it was located close to cities. So some older pictures, people think that local food is all the rage today. Well, travel back in time, there's a lot of local food in every city you go to. So goats, sheep, chickens, pigs in Manchester. If you've read Engels, Mark's co-author, he complains how filthy Manchester is because all those Irish workers bring their pigs and they're everywhere in the streets, in the basements, in the backyards. But again, it kind of makes sense because you could not move food over a long distance. You wanted fresh meat. You basically had to produce it yourself, and you had a way to recycle your waste into high-quality proteins. Dairy production in London in 1798, again, milk doesn't travel very well, so this is the city of London here. And you've got all these dairy establishments around the city. Cows are fed by either bringing in animal feed from the countryside or else by, again, eating a bunch of organic waste, brewery leftovers, the grains that you would turn into beer, you'd be left with something. You could always feed it to cows. And again, this is because land transportation was so bad. What people don't realize too is that a lot of people were growing produce around cities. So these are old-fashioned technologies, so old-fashioned greenhouses. They're made out of glass and bricks and wood as opposed to plastic and aluminum today or something like that. And these were really significant at one point in time. So these are Parisian maraîchers or truck farmer. And I would like to draw your attention to a few things here. So these people are very good at producing local vegetable year-round. You can look at the tree here in the back, no leaves in it. This is probably very cool. So if you can see that in the back, there is a wall behind the field. You would see always walls in urban environments like Paris to cut the wind and create something of a microclimate. These people are also using Plush, which they put over their plants to make sure that they can grow in winter conditions in Paris, and straw mats of some sort to even keep them warmer. Now, people don't realize that as late as in the late 19th century in Paris, about 1/6 of the city area was devoted to food production, essentially produce. The local maraîchers produce about 100,000 tons of produce each year. They can afford to do that because automobiles have not yet come on the scene. So we have a lot of horses in Paris which produce a lot of manure. So these guys produce their vegetables, bring them to the market, and bring back horse manure, out of which they become very productive at growing this kind of stuff. But obviously trying to grow produce in the winter in Paris is a very difficult job. So I went back to the original sources. The oldest source written by actually truck farmers on what they do was published in the early 1840s. And they describe, well, we work on average 18 to 20 hours a day during the busy season, and then we kind of slack off the rest of the year, only 14 to 16 hours of rest a day. Why do they work so much? Well, obviously, when you have clush, you want to make sure in the summer that your vegetables don't overeat, so you've got to turn them over all the time. You've got to take things to the market. They have wells, but they need to get the water out, then they need to irrigate, and it's not like a modern greenhouse where you turn on and off a switch. I mean, these guys work very hard. And they're really proud of the fact that they were able to defeat seasonality. I mean, today among locavores, a lot of people will say, well, we should only eat what is in season. And what those guys wrote in the 1840s is very interesting. In a sense, what they say, well, nobody respected our fathers because they were just growing vegetables. But then we became able to produce green asparagus year-round because of this technology. And then we got some respect. And over time, they tend to expand the range of things that they grow. In the late 19th century, Paris, they grow pineapples. And they not only sell them locally, they will ship them to London or whoever else is willing to pay them more money for what they produce. So they will send to the highest bidder. They don't care so much about their neighbors. Although you see a number of accounts of rich people selecting some of their maraîchers, visiting them often, making sure that they get the best produce for their household or their restaurants. But really, these guys don't have the same kind of ethos that locavores are promoting today. They're in business. I was going to say something about which I'm actually. They work very hard, 18, 20 hours a day. They want the maximum value they can get for what they produce. And then everything changes. You've probably never heard that story because it disappeared. This whole system in Paris disappeared within a decade when the railroad made it possible to grow green asparagus where they should be grown. Southern France, Italy, Spain. You don't have to wake up in the middle of the night to make sure that your produce are freezing. Or you don't have to turn over all the cloche during the day to make sure that they're not overeating. And you don't have to get horse manure all the time. You don't have to spend your life in horse manure. Better options comes along. The railroad completely changes the dynamic of perishable food production. And so dairy production becomes a rural activity, while at least milk production, butter and cheese have been around for a longer time. And all these things disappear from large cities in both Europe and North America. And interestingly, in the early 20th century, my sense of the literature is that people think that what comes from a long distance must necessarily be better than what they grow locally. Otherwise, why would people bother shipping in that stuff? So this is an advertisement for Cape Cod cranberries. They say that they're the best in the world. And I'm not making this up. This is not something I've photoshopped. There was really something called Long Distance Brand. And the idea is that the best cranberries in the world are produced in Cape Cod. Why would you bother trying to produce them yourselves when we can do it better than you? Get the best quality money can buy. Okay, water transportation, I've already told you how important it was historically, how much more economical it was. So grains were obviously the first things that were moved over long distances, but also olive oil, fish paste, okay, these kinds of things. Cities also, medieval London would not have survived without its fish market. So, and the fish obviously often came from more than 100 miles of the city. And again, most people would have starved in London without the amount of fish that was delivered there. But you're kind of limited when you rely on ocean currents and wind to move things around. So the steam engine is eventually developed, and again, the steam engine does to maritime transportation what the railroad did to land transportation. So being located where you are, you might know that in the 19th century, going up the Mississippi River was very complicated. So what happened often historically, at least in the early decades of the 19th century, people would get things down the Mississippi to New Orleans. It was easy, you would let the current do that. And then you would have to walk all the way back up to where you came from, because at certain times of the year, the Mississippi River was just too powerful to go upstream. And so the steamboats comes along and then everything changes. Suddenly, places that have a lot of a certain type of food, let's say Cincinnati, which produces a lot of meat and stuff, can now get things like sugar and coffee cheaper because you can send them up the Mississippi River. And so prices tend to become more equalized along locations. So steamboats are important, but the real difference is steamships. So for you, a steamship is perhaps something like the Titanic, but obviously a lot of steamships were cargo ships. They were not ships devoted mainly to passengers. I don't know if you can see that in the back, but this is how radical a transformation the steam engine brought to world trade. So the white lines here are sail ship routes. Again, you're kind of limited by ocean currents and the way the wind blows, and there are only so many places you can go to economically. You want to go to India from England, you have a problem because you have the monsoon there, and the monsoon is just not a lot of rain, but also a change in wind patterns. So you get there, the best case scenario, it takes you several months to get from England to India, and then you're stuck there because the monsoon, the rain comes, you cannot fly, and then the wind blows in the back direction, and so moving things out of India is really not easy. Steam engine comes along, all of this disappears. People can go get the food when it is ready and deliver it when people need it elsewhere. So the steamship, again, like the railroad, completely changes the dynamic of the way people produce and trade food. So in time too, some canals are built, so Suez and Panama, and again makes moving goods around a lot cheaper and also a lot faster than used to be the case before. So following the steam revolution, if you will, subsistence agriculture is done with in advanced economies. People begin to specialize in what they do best and shipping whatever they produce to large cities. And as I was already telling you, people gave up producing most kinds of food in big cities and increasingly rely on things produced elsewhere. So improved transportation plus better conservation technologies too. Refrigeration is made possible by the steam engine, or at least steam technology, results everywhere in the creations of specialized monocultural regions. So this is a rough map of the US agricultural landscape in the 1920s. So you'll have the emergence of the Corn Belt here, which is smaller than it is today. Spring wheat in the north, winter wheat south of the Corn Belt, tropical crops obviously in Florida and southern California. And goods begin to travel very long distances. So in the late 19th century, as I was telling you, urban agriculture gets out of cities. So farmers simply cannot compete anymore. People want to build factories. They can provide better salaries. There's more demand for their goods. Food production can occur in the countryside. Factories really need to be in cities for the regions I was telling you. People begin to understand the germ theory of disease comes along. People understand that living right next door to your pigs or your chicken is not always good for your health, so there are a few epidemics. People are tired of working 20 hours a day produce in Paris in the winter. They can get better paying jobs in factories and get their Sunday free. So horse manure is no longer available. Gee whiz. And again, the face of the countryside changes a lot. So a situation is reached in 1903 where, according to a geographer of the time, the typical New York City middle-class breakfast looks something like this. The bread will be made of wheat, which was probably grown in Minnesota. The coffee came from Sumatra or Java, the tea from China, sugar from Cuba. Yeah, Cuba was open to trade in those days. Meat from Texas, prepared in St. Louis, and spices from all sorts of tropical locations. The geographer, red wheat, tells you all these things are found in the great majority of households. They're bought in city markets like this one. Again, I apologize for the poor quality of the image, but I selected it because you can see a lot of bananas here. Bananas become available in the northeastern urban markets in the late 19th century. They can withstand long distance transportation. They're very cheap. People really, you know that song, Yes, We Have No Bananas? So some people said it was written at one point where banana producers were struggling with a disease and bananas were less available. At least that's a theory behind the origin of the song. So Redway tells his readers, the dwelling of Western civilization and its various furnishing, unlike the log house of the frontiersmen of a century or two ago, is a product of almost the whole world. And he says that's a good thing. In 1900, people don't idealize their life in a log house on the prairies. They remember what it was like. They're happy to have bananas and have more different kinds of food. Okay, so in the last few decades, by far the most significant advance in terms of transportation is what we call intermodal container shippings. Long story short, you wanted to load or unload a boat before containers came along. It could take you weeks, sometimes months. Today, a huge container ship comes in a port and might be out of there in less than a day, 12 to 24 hours, depending on the size of it. So things move around much more speedily. And you can see a lot of white containers on that ship. So they're refrigerated units. You can have refrigerated containers. And so we've increasingly been able to move produce the world over because we can move them in a refrigerated environment and we can move them a lot faster than in the past. Air cargo also plays a role. And what has happened, a number of countries have given up on trying to be self-sufficient, like communist China. They've opened up to the world market, and people there are still willing to pick apples, unlike in many other advanced economies. So put all of that together, and we've got the supermarket we have today, where the food is increasingly sourced globally and comes from many different locations. So what I would argue is that overall it's been a good thing. I mean, we don't have famines anymore in prosperous economies. We live longer and healthier lives, we have better nutrition, and the food is a lot cheaper today than it used to be. How much cheaper? Well, the same basket of good today would have cost you 2 times more in the late 1950s. I saw, it's not exactly a study, but somebody compared prices in London in the 1850s when they're importing pineapples from Paris to prices today. You pay only 1/13 of what it would have cost you proportionally in 1851 for the same basket of goods in London today. We're much taller than we used to be. This is the average height in the United States, 1850, 5 feet, 7.4 inches, 5 feet and 7.4 inches. 2000, 5 feet, 9.5 inches. We've become taller, we live longer, we have healthier lives. Better nutrition is not everything, but it is a significant part of that story. And this can only be understood in terms of the advances I've told you about. Okay, so now we get to the Locavore fad. What's wrong with having defeated famine, being healthier, living longer? For the life of me, I can't figure it. I mean, you tell me, but a lot of people think that we should pay more for our food. Again, I can discuss this argument about sustainability in more detail in the question period, but you cannot deny that the food today is more varied, cheaper, and just as nutritious, or even more than before. So my wife and I are not exactly against local food, just when it doesn't make sense. And we saw periods in the 20th century when life didn't make sense, and you saw a comeback of local food. So wars, local farmers are hurting, economic hard times. So this is a poster from the USDA in the First World War when they encouraged people to have chickens in their backyard, can their produce, grow their stuff, turn their grass into gardens. But the point was that people don't stick to it. The war is over, they're happy to let the professionals grow their food. This is a backyard garden in Washington, D.C. in the First World War, not too far from the White House. It will be built over a few years after the picture is taken. In the Depression, there were a number of relief gardens, and then whenever local farmers were hurting, there were campaigns to promote local food in the early 20th century. They never lasted. So what about now? So your first lady here. Do you know if they used to have a garden in their house in Hyde Park? Or did they pick up gardening when they moved to the White House? What do I know? But anyway, it seems to be a big part of what they do today. It's still a bad idea, I would argue. Why is that? Well, first, there's this notion that we need to get to know our neighbors more, to need to know our farmers more. But were people really trusting their neighbors 2 centuries ago? Not really. So this is a book published in the 1820 by this fellow. It's a German chemist who's relocated to the UK. what everybody's complaining at the time is that you cannot trust local businessmen. You know, they will put water into your milk, chicory into your coffee. You can never trust what you're buying. And you have pretty much the same problem today at farmers markets. I mean, a number of activists will recognize that, you know, a lot of people behind those stalls who greet you with, you know, open smiles and, you know, are very welcoming, will simply go to Costco and pretend that their food is local and sell it to you. This is a huge problem. In Los Angeles, a TV crew went to the farms where these things were supposedly produced, and what did they find in the field? Weeds, nothing else. You cannot really always trust people, even if they're your neighbors. You know, bad people have to live somewhere, and some of them will happen to be your neighbors. So, historically, how did markets deal with that? Well, we developed brands and grades and standards. So the Quaker Oat story, I don't know how many of you know it. It had nothing to do with the Society of Friends. The founders of Quaker Oat just knew that the Quakers had a reputation for being people that you could trust. And they started manufacturing, you know, oatmeal and stuff like that and selling it to the US. But wherever you bought oatmeal, even though the story, or at least the face was phony, the product was not. You would always get the same thing wherever you bought it in the United States. And this is why brands emerge in the first place, to establish this trust relationship between customers and corporations. So much for social capital. What about the idea that it is good for the local economy? Well, if local produce is in season and you get your money's worth, this is obviously fine. People don't need a buy local campaign to buy local produce when it is good and in season. But what if you pay a what if you force a school board to pay more for its food because it is local and it has no other attributes? People think, well, that's fine, you keep all this money locally. But it's really just what some people call the broken window fallacy. I know that those of you who got an economic education here get a good one, but if you're not familiar with it, let me just say that, look at it this way. If you pay more for your food at your local school board, don't you have less money to spend on other things? And don't other local people get jobs through that? So if you have to pay more on your food and you cannot renovate your gym that year, don't some local carpenter or electrician or plumber not get a job? You don't want to buy from foreigners, fine. Why would they buy from you? Where will their money come from? You don't create economic development by paying more for lesser quality. You create jobs by paying less for better quality products. People are creative, they come up with better ways of doing things. This is how you create economic development. The broken window fallacy is the story of a couple of kids playing together. One breaks a window and somebody goes, well, this might look bad, but you know, what would the glazier do if the windows were never broken? But then if the person who was to pay for the repair had not paid for that, he would have bought something else. And so on the one hand, you have an economy that has everything plus something else, and an economy where people have had to replace the window and don't have that extra thing. You don't create jobs by paying more for a lesser quality product. Then on the transformation side too, you have things that are called economies of scale. So this is a Harvard man, not a Chicago man, Frank Taussig, who explains the importance of concentrating production. Being in Chicago, I thought I would talk about the history of meat packing. Sorry if this is not very nice, but this is how people used to kill, you know, I don't know if you see his eyes in the back here, his or her eyes. You kind of suspect that something bad is coming. So obviously this is what happens to it. Well, historically, obviously most meat did not travel well, or at least in the case of cattle, it would actually travel well, but people had to kill it locally. The problem is that things were very wasteful. And then with the railroad, refrigeration, large-scale technology, the Chicago meatpacking districts comes along. Now I know this is a controversial story, but the thing about the Chicago meatpacking district is that it drastically reduced the price of beef in North America. People were using resources a lot more efficiently, and also they were able to turn the polluting stuff, something that the stuff that the local butcher could not use, into all sorts of products. So before plastics came along, a lot of things were made out of animal bones. So concentrating production, you generate economies of scale. Beef became more affordable, and what would have been a source of pollution was turned into something useful. Okay, what about this whole food mile thing? This is a standard illustration of what the Locavores say is wrong with our system. And you can see literally, the apple literally falls from the tree into the consumer's plate. And here it travels a lot. Something missing from that picture? Well, food production is, you know, things don't just fall from the tree. You need to plant the tree, you need pesticides, you need other inputs. And essentially, what the Locavores are looking at is this segment here, supply chain transportation to consumers. They forget everything else. They forget that you need to heat the greenhouse, that you need to move the inputs around, that you need all sorts, you need diesels, fertilizers to grow stuff. And in essence, what all the data tells us is that long distance really doesn't matter in the overall scheme of things. The energy/environmental impact of food production is something like 83% of the overall energy expenditure. In the US, long distance transportation is 4%. You want to reduce the environmental impact of food production? You focus on 83. You don't worry about the 4. It's really insignificant. There is a reason why things are produced in certain locations and not others. Again, think of those Parisian truck farmers. They had to create their heat to grow their stuff. You move things down along the Mediterranean coast, nature provides it free to you. You don't need to generate heat to grow things. And again, the mode of transportation matters a lot. The reason why long-distance transportation is so insignificant is that moving thing on a container ship is extremely efficient. The boat floats, it has a powerful diesel engine, it burns the worst fuel that is available on the market. Moving apples from New Zealand to England really implies almost nothing in terms of apple, often less than if you took apples produced locally and that would have been carried to the local market in the back of a pickup. That's how efficient container shipping is. So the full mile mistaken assumption is that local production is really foreign production minus transportation, but in the real world, of course, some locations are just better than others at growing stuff. So some comparative data between the United Kingdom and New Zealand. For the same amount of resources, the New Zealanders can produce 3 times many more apple, 4 times more lamb meat, and 2 times more milk solid. The pasture land in New Zealand is extremely rich. Clover is not native, but it has sort of taken over their pasture land. And the weather is perfect. You can leave the cows outside year-round. You want to produce that stuff in Wisconsin? Well, you've got to have Eaton barns in the winter. New Zealand, you leave the cows outside year-round. No expenses, no energy required. Then monocultures produce a lot more food on a lot less land. The result is that even though you have less diversified environment, a lot of less productive farmland was abandoned these last few decades, and forests have made a huge comeback in the United States. You don't see it so much in Illinois, but if you go to a place like Vermont or in the Appalachian corridor here, you will see forests that have regrown over the last few decades because people realize they might as well buy their food from Illinois rather than try to grow their own corn. Okay, the food security argument. Essentially, locavores worship diversity in all its form, except that they don't quite realize that locavorism implies that you put all your agricultural eggs in one local basket. And again, as I was telling you, subsistence farming was not sustainable in the past. People would go hungry. And the same thing will happen today with polycultures. Things will go wrong. But when you have monocultures, you have by definition long distance trade. When you have bad years, you can rely on other people. When other people have bad years, you have good years, you can send them your surplus. People are much safer that way. And if you're afraid of depending on foreigner, my simple answer is, again, diversification. Have multiple foreign suppliers, not just one, as opposed to your local geographical area. Okay, nutrition and safety, I'm almost done. The basic argument of locavores is that fresher is more nutritious. Okay, fair enough. For a few weeks each year, you get local produce that is fresher than things that is shipped from other locations. What about the rest of the year, though? I mean, you need to freeze your food, you need to freeze your produce, you need to can it. If your basic argument is that fresher is more nutritious, well, you cannot beat stuff that is shipped from other locations. So let's assume that local food is excellent for, let's say, 5 weeks out of 52. Well, you can get fresh stuff shipped from other locations the rest of the year. Let's call it very good. Isn't that better overall in terms of nutrition than canning your local food and subsisting on that? I mean, again, if you say fresher is more nutritious, you cannot make the case for local food. You're better off relying on local producers in season and foreign suppliers the rest of the year. Latitude and storage, yeah, what people don't understand is that, for example, New Zealand ships a lot of apples to the northern hemisphere because, you know what, when it's our summer here, it's their winter down there and vice versa. So I grew up in Quebec where apples really become available in September. You want to eat them in March, you need to put them in cold storage, spend a lot of energy keeping them until March. You will lose a significant, well, a certain percentage of them in the process. But you know what? Apples are produced in March and April in New Zealand. You put them on a container boat, they end up on a supermarket shelf 10 days later. You did not have to pay for storage. There has been no waste during the storage period. This is why we have New Zealand apple at certain times of the year. Safety. This is a complex issue, but in essence, all I want to say is that there's plenty of bad stuff around us, and there are also economies of scale in food safety for things like salmonella and E. coli. Large facilities can actually track these things, and they have very stringent safety procedures. Small producers do not. So the worst case of food poisoning and death in the last few years, the last quarter century actually, to occur in the United States, occurred not too long ago. I don't know how many of you followed that story. So a cantaloupe producer in Colorado had a major case of listeriosis, 25 people die. FDA inspectors went there, and what did they notice? Well, they had basically no safety procedures there. They sent some of their cantaloupes to Cantal farms. The truck probably ran over some cow manure, brought it back. They had an open door right next to the truck. Then the water would accumulate on the ground. They would use their machinery to process all kinds of different produce, not just cantaloupes. Very bad conditions that you would never have seen in a modern large-scale plant. And it's not that small producers are evil, it's just that they cannot develop the knowledge and the safety procedures that large-scale operations that can generate economies of scale can do. So in conclusion, locavorism, we argue, delivers higher cost and greater poverty, especially for third world exporters, people who are working in less advanced economy, whose only way to generate wealth is ship stuff to North America, no environmental and social benefits, less security and nutrition, and again, significant penalty to developing economies. So what my wife and I are arguing in our book is that we need more trade, not less of it. Food will be grown where it is the most suitable for. We will need less agricultural land overall. We will let the forest regrow or the savanna recreate itself in many locations, and get rid of subsidies that encourage people to waste money, water, fertilizers, stuff like that. So the book will be available in June, if I may be allowed that last blog. Thank you. So, I don't know.
Why don't we entertain questions for Pierre, and we'll spend 15 minutes or so doing that. So go ahead, Pierre.
Yeah.
Questions?
Are you also convinced? I've made my case. No need to buy my book now. You're all convinced. Well, Wheaton is a really special environment. Usually I have people throwing me tomatoes at this point or something. No? I must be very convincing.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. Oh, yes. Yes.
You would say that locavores want to go back to the farm.
If you're logical, yes.
Logically, if
you follow it to the end, yes.
To the extreme end. Obviously, we can't go back. We have to go forward. We have to start with where we are now and go forward. So my question is that, would you say there's any benefit to the ethic or the mindset of the local food movement that we could take with us to improve from where we are now going forward?
Well, the main lesson I derive from it, and I apologize if this is my Catholic upbringing, but no, it's rather that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't see, honestly, any benefit from that. You will have competitive in-season local product. You don't need a local movement to sell that. People will buy the better stuff that they can get at the supermarket. What the local food movement has done, I think, is shift the attention of people from the real issues, which are subsidies, barriers to trade, some practices that might be questionable, and focus people's attention on a non-issue, food miles. So honestly, I've scratched my head. I've tried to come up with something positive. And no, it's a distraction from the real food issues. I mean, you still have 1 billion people in this world who are malnourished. And you know what? Most of them are subsistence farmers. You want to see local food, you go to sub-Saharan Africa. You know, the roads there are bad. People cannot export their things. They cannot afford fertilizers. They cannot afford pesticides. They have no safety procedure in terms of food processing. Last statistics I saw, about 700,000 people die of food poisoning every year in Africa. The figure was pretty much the same in the US proportionally a century ago. Today you have roughly about 100 times less cases of food poisoning than would have been the case a century ago. Of course, we hear more about them because we have better procedures to track food problems, and we have a 24 hours news cycle, and obviously something needs to be on the air. But honestly, you want to do goods, you can do many good things with your life. There are many worthy causes to pursue, and I would argue local food is not one of them. Now that should generate some questions. Yes. Yes.
Thanks for coming here. And I would just front this question with a quick little comment. Actually, right outside this window, we're preparing some soil to have a new community garden here on campus.
Yes.
And it's funny you mentioned the sunflower seeds because we're actually thinking about covering the whole place
Yes.
with sunflower seeds in light of it being local, and it's a good way to repair the soil. But my question comes from the part in the presentation regarding social capital.
Yeah.
And you use a historical case saying that historically gardens didn't produce social capital, but distrust between people.
Yeah.
Have you looked into
Well, I'll be honest with you. What we say in the book is that it's not because something is true that it is necessarily important. You will get to know your local farmers. I grew up in a small rural town. Most people are nice. You might want to support them. You might think it's worth paying extra. That's fine. But it's not because it's true that it is important. And honestly, if you push the Locavore ethos to its logical end, then you end up penalizing farmers in less advanced economies. And this is what has happened in the United Kingdom. You know, there are people promote things, oh, don't buy anything that was shipped through airplanes. Well, do you want Kenya to develop? I mean, that's the one opportunity they have. They have year-round sunshine. They have people who are still willing to work in agriculture. And then you're going to hammer them on the head with this thing where they can't afford tractors. They can't afford fertilizers. I mean, this is organic de facto because they can't afford any other input. And I think they've been penalized unfairly because uncompetitive producers in the UK use the local food mile, or at least the food mile notion, as an excuse not to do that. Now, I'm not familiar with your sunflower thing. If you do it for educational purposes, I wish people would understand more what it takes to grow food. So as an educational experiment, I'm all for it. And, you know, if you can eat the local thing, that's fine. I have no problem with that, as long as you understand that an educational experiment doesn't really make a global food policy. I mean, if you want to do that, fine. It's probably better to do that than other things you could do with your time. But if I were you, I would view it as an educational opportunity. And if you want to give away sunflower seeds, then that's fine. I mean, I have no problem with local food being used for charitable purposes. But I'm afraid many people think, honestly, that they're doing a lot more good than they really are, and that they forget the broader picture. And again, don't ask themselves why. All these past local food movements, even in this century, I mean, victory gardens didn't last. I was telling you, in the early 20th century, Pennsylvania had a lot of these local food movements because they could not compete with Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland, which had better soil. And so people tried to push that idea for a while, and then they realized, well, there's no point. Pennsylvania cannot compete. And they specialized in other things, and they were prosperous for a while. So I'm sorry, but yeah, that's my take on it, honestly. Yes?
Yeah, you talked about necessity of cities
Yeah.
for economic development, and I think of Tadero's urban migration model. What do you think of rural initiatives, rural development initiatives? I think that plays a big part in development as a whole, not just economic development, development as a whole. And it seems like you're kind of pushing that aside.
Well, what I would argue, if you look at all the data that's been collected in less advanced economies, you talk to people who have moved recently from the countryside to the cities, and you ask them, are you better off? And they all say yes. I mean, they're not stupid. The reason why they move from the countryside to the cities is that they have access to hospital, better jobs. You get a job in a factory, at least you're pretty much assured of a paycheck, whereas, you know, you work very hard in the countryside, and then a flood might come along, destroy all the hard work you've done. People are happier moving to cities. That's been true across history, otherwise people will not have moved to cities. And if you want to develop the countryside, it's sad to say, but most people will have to leave farming. There's no other way out of it. The most urbanized societies are the ones that by far produce the most food and are the most food secure. The world would be much better off, I would argue, if when the world population reaches 9 billion in a few decades, 90 million farmers, which would be, you know, applying the American ratio to the world population, would be 90 million farmers located in the best location, produce the food for the whole world, than having the situation that we have right now where you might still have, I don't know, a billion subsistence farmer who are pretty miserable. So you can have rural development, but typically what will happen, farms will become bigger, more productive, the best farmer will stay, most other peoples will move to city, and in time, cities tend to generate spin-off businesses that relocate to the countryside. And this is how I would argue you develop an economy. Any other strategy, they've all been tried in the past. That's kind of my original specialty in economic geography, regional development. They haven't worked. Yes?
I think one of the positives of the Locavore movement is that it puts people back in touch with where their food comes from. Because I think in the United States especially, where there's so much consumption of prepared foods and whatnot, people really have lost sight, and we have actually an issue of overnutrition. We've got obesity rates that are really quite high. And so what the Locavore movement has also sort of emphasized is this idea of where does your food come from? And there's been local programs from farm to plate where you're educating kids about this so that they learn about nutrition and they become more in touch with food again, the food source, which I think that's a positive.
Yeah, well, but then here I would separate nutrition from community-supported agriculture. Again, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but so a community-supported agriculture, you basically enter a deal with a farmer and they will deliver whatever it is that they grow to you that week. And what a lot of people who have studied that have realized is that this is a very wasteful practice. If you order a certain amount of food months in advance, you don't know if the kids will be gone for the weekend, if you will have extra guests. The farmers will send you whatever they produce, and at some point in the season, you'll be flooded with leafy vegetables for 2 months or whatever it is that they can grow. And there's just a lot of waste in the process. I mean, there's a reason why intermediaries emerge in the first place. So I'm all for food education. I'm all for kids eating better. But what I find ironic about locavores is that they only care about food. They don't care about their iPod or the computers they use or whatever technology they use to set up their movement. The printer that they use to advertise their things, they're not local, and they don't stick to old-fashioned technology. I've yet to meet a locavore that uses, rotary phone dials. I don't know if you kids know what that is. An old-fashioned typewriter. They want the best and the most recent technology produced in the best locations in the world for everything except for food. And again, at some point, isn't there any consistency there? So I'm all for better educating people in terms of nutrition, in terms of explaining them where the food is grown, why we don't grow coffee in Illinois and things like that. But I think locavores are taking it a step too far. So I'm all for educating people on nutrition and telling them about the history of food and that, food does not magically appear on a truck on its way to the supermarket. But beyond that, if you want to be consistent, don't limit yourself to food. I mean, buy local typewriters, buy local computers. Food is part of the whole package. And I'm sorry, but I just want to be consistent here.
Let me make
Oh.
go ahead.
Yes.
What would you say about the problem of states that are sometimes major exporters of a key crop,
Yes.
say rice, for example, and then they decide to stop their export?
That's-
Like happened in the last kind of major global food crisis.
Yes.
And this obviously is not a problem for Canada, for the United States, really. because
No,
you
but-
you do grow a lot of food here, but for other countries, that sparked a lot of real serious fear.
I know. Well, the problem with rice, and maybe my wife will see that, sorry, honey. The big problem with rice is Japan. And what I mean is the following thing. The world wheat market is pretty much integrated because most countries are willing to import wheat. Canada exports a lot of wheat to Italy, for example. But for historical reasons, Japan, which is by far the biggest rice consumer in the world, has kept its frontiers closed to rice export. Doesn't make sense to grow rice in Japan as opposed to, say, Thailand and other places. So the rice market is a lot less integrated than the grain or corn or soybean market. And that's a major problem. But the Japanese justify that historically by saying, well, we were closed onto ourselves until the late 1860s, then we opened up and we began to import more food, but then people were kind of reluctant to buy our manufactured products. So we had to invade Manchuria and grow soybeans and invade Taiwan and grow rice, and we're going to create this co-prosperity fear where we would be more self-sufficient. The problem, as I see it, is that's why you need free trade. I mean, what you say is exactly true, and the food crisis of the last few years was made much worse by politicians who have this reflex of always blocking exports. But you do that, and what you see throughout history, and these policies have been around for thousands of years, is that you discourage farmers from investing in their business. If they cannot find the best consumers worldwide, they won't become more productive, they won't scale up. So the only issue there is trade liberalization. But somehow it seems to me people are very reluctant to depend on other people for food. They tend to forget that the key is to have multiple suppliers, and then you'll be okay. I mean, the Netherlands, for example, was the first country that basically lifted all of its import and export restrictions on food several centuries ago. The first country in Europe to get rid of famine. You could always find people who would sell them things when they had good years and surplus. And they were a maritime power, so they could easily bring things to the Netherlands. We need to go down that road. But yeah, no, I agree with you. And unfortunately, though, these issues are very emotional. But yeah, that's a very serious. That's the kind of issue we should be focusing on, not food miles. Yeah.
Anyone else? I'd like to ask you to do one thing. If you could fill out the surveys on tonight's presentation, and also I'd like to make an announcement about the Hunger Program is having a symposium this weekend on February 24 and 25 in Corey Gym. So please be aware to inform you of that, and please fill out the surveys when you have time. Thank you again, Pierre, for your presentation.